Welcome to the Grief Ladies, the practical guide to what comes next. I'm Kelly Doherty.
And I'm Karen Arnold, and we are two grief professionals with over 50 years of combined experience. We're here to validate, educate, and give you tangible tools you can actually use.
Each episode motivates you to take action and reminds you it's okay to want to feel better. This is the Grief Ladies, a guide to what comes next.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Grief Ladies podcast. I am Karen here with Kelly, and today we are doing the letter I for interacting, which, as Kelly often highlights, is one of my favorite parts of all of this, just learning how to communicate and deal with some of the people in your life. We may be talking a little bit about boundaries. We have a very special guest here today that's going to be talking about a lot of things. Her name is Sara Shelton. So, Sara, welcome. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, we usually start out just by reading your bio because right away that kind of gives people a good idea of who you are and what you do. So I wanted to get my cursor over here so I could do that. So Sara Shelton is a suicide loss survivor and founder of Griefly Collective, an initiative focused on helping institutions and families navigate what comes after traumatic death. Her work centers on postvention, family systems, and the role of boundaries in grief. Drawing from lived experience and professional leadership in peer support spaces, she speaks candidly about navigating minimizing comments, shifting family roles, and the tension between care and performance after loss. She is especially interested in how boundaries function as an act of love during grief. So, Sara, why don't we jump right in? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and what you're doing.
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity. Uh, my background's actually in gerontology. So I spent the first half of my career in aging services. And I loved that. I fell in love very early on with the aging population. And in 2019, I lost my older sister to suicide. And Heidi died in October, and COVID hit like 6 months later. And so it was a very isolating experience, not only because of COVID, but the stigma associated with suicide. I grieved very differently than the rest of my family. I like to say I grieved out loud, and that was not how the rest of my family grieved. So that made it a little bit lonely. And so I just got curious about the lack of resources available to suicide loss survivors. There's so much emphasis on prevention, but there isn't a lot of emphasis and or funding, to be honest, for postvention. And um, suicide loss survivors are 3.6 times more likely to die by suicide. So from my perspective, my whole push is prevention begins with the bereaved. So take care of those people that are so deeply impacted by the loss, and it can trickle out to um, better better endings. Let's say that because it's common for within families particularly. So I actually just launched recently a project called the Postvention Project, and it's really around providing infrastructure and training for different organizations and groups of people, primarily clinicians, but also first responders, organizations that may have a suicide or have an employee that loses someone to suicide, and how do they hold that? How do they handle it? How do they communicate it? Because it's just a foreign, people don't know, and it's very uncomfortable. And so providing people with the tools to um, handle it a little bit more gracefully.
And I think today we're going to kind of want to talk about two things in some ways, because as Kelly and I were saying, actually, Sara, you're probably one of the first people that we've had on to really talk in depth about suicide loss, which is something that does impact a lot of people I work with and Kelly works with as well. But I do want to talk a little bit about the boundaries first, and maybe what you talked about with your family, coping with it differently. And that's something that is so important to recognize, because we feel like in a family, well, we all lost the same person. We should all come together. We should all be supporting one another. but it's so difficult because everybody's being impacted. Everywhere you turn, there's hurt, and people are handling things very, very differently. And some are kind of going off on their own, and retreating, and some are maybe trying to support one another. And, it's just all going to be very, very different. So tell us a little bit about your experience with that, what you learned, and what you're trying to pass on to people to help them understand better.
Um, I'm very open about this. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I was about 2 years, just starting my third year of sobriety when Heidi died. And so, one of the pieces that's been a big part of my recovery process has been that reliance on chosen family. And that looked like the recovery community for me. Um, with that said, I think it's important to find those people that will just be there. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to. There's a lack of judgment um, that exists, I think, sometimes, and you have to sort of figure that out along the way because there's a lot of curiosity, and people can often say very hurtful things. And so I think people become more boundaried after someone dies by suicide because of that sense of curiosity and how did they do it, and all of the questions that come with that. You do create boundaries within family systems. What I've learned, I've been doing a lot of interviews with suicide loss survivors, and what I'm finding is that people offer one another grace. So if you can recognize that you are grieving differently, you're not doing it better than I am. We all we all have different tools. So one of the things that I look at, for instance, is both of my parents were raised in families where there wasn't a lot of communication, there wasn't a lot of empathy. Um, and so they were raised to not talk about things, and you just kind of move forward. And so that's sort of how my family navigated and continues. And I think because of my journey through active alcoholism and recovery and becoming very comfortable with sharing my story and being authentic, I've done it a little differently. And I think that creates a rub. And so I try to be sensitive and, maintain confidentiality when I can, obviously not talking broadly about um, my family specifically, but I think that the dynamics are important to talk about because suicide doesn't just happen, right? There's things that lead up to it, and that is very relevant to the family system.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you talk about Karen and I both loved the line that boundaries are an act of love. And
Mhm.
so can you explain that for our listeners what you mean by that?
Yeah.
Because I
Um,
always say my quote is always that boundaries are about people keeping people in our life, not out of our life. And so
exactly.
that's,
Yeah.
and so kind of thinking about it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think that for me specifically, that was very difficult because I tend to be a people pleaser. And so I've had to learn, Heidi died 6.5 years ago, and I'm still learning what that looks like. But I think, um, you don't have to answer the questions. You don't have to um, be in a position where you don't feel equipped to kind of perform like society wants you to perform. I think there's these expectations that come with grief. And um, so I think of boundaries as self protection, but also preservation and um, keeping yourself safe, but also acknowledging and reaching out to other people. So it's a tricky one. But I have to say, I think boundaries, a lot of it is about self love. It's about making sure that you are taken care of because nobody else can take care of you for you. Like you have to, and so boundaries keep yourself safe. And also, like you said, allow people to stay in your life because you have them, right? So, yeah, leaving when you need to, not engaging in a conversation. I can't talk about that right now. Um, you know, that I think that's important.
Yeah.
So I'm curious because one of the things that I see happen a lot and here I work with a lot of moms who have had children die from suicide. And so they talk a lot about the stigma and maybe not getting the support from people in their life because of that stigma. I actually did a group with a couple of years ago with moms whose teenage boys died from suicide because I was working with so many of them. And what these moms talked about was this was the first grief group that they'd been a part of that they didn't feel like they had to worry about the stigma, that they didn't have to filter what they were saying, that everybody in that room just got it. And how helpful that was, and a couple of them have still stayed in contact and are quite good friends, I think, because of that. So why do you think we still in this day and age, why do you think there's still such a stigma attached with suicide loss?
Well, I think the stigma, just generally speaking, around mental health is still alive and well. I don't think that people see it sometimes as a legitimate illness, which it very much is. And so I think, and I think with young people, it's tricky too, because I think there's these assumptions made from talking with other parents. You hear people asking, well, didn't you see the signs? Or, didn't, like, where were you? And, this sort of like blame thing. Um, and it's really unfair. And I've also had interactions with mothers specifically who have gone into grief groups, and none of the other participants have experienced suicide. And in one case, a mother said, well, my person didn't want to die. And so you're kind of like excluding them from the conversation. And so I think that speaks to what I'm also trying to create is opportunity for people to connect with other survivors because there isn't that stigma. And I think I learned that in recovery communities so I kind of I'm carrying that forward to some extent. But I think that I volunteer for an organization here in Tucson called Tunadito, and we have separate groups for different types of death. So the groups that I work with the adults in the traumatic death group. So there's suicide, homicide, accident, and overdose. And people are just open. They're kiddos. It's for children, but the parents come too, and we just talk openly. I'll never forget one father saying that the question was, what would you do if you could speak with your person again? And he just said, I am so full of rage. And, people don't say those things in general company. It's, um, so I think you're right in terms of there being kind of a comfort in interacting with other people that are on the same journey, support groups, things like that. And I think a big piece of what we see at Tunadito too is people that are just starting on this journey can see other people. We laugh, and you see like it gets better, and it's not just somebody. Oh, it's okay, it'll get better. Everything happens for a reason. All of those platitudes that will undo me. Um, but you see in action those people, moving on in a way that also honors their person, but they move forward. And I think that's important for people to see too when they're early in the grief process.
If you're looking for a place where you don't have to explain why the days feel different after someone you love has died, we created something for you. The Grief Ladies community is our private, free Facebook group where you can connect with others who get it. It's a space for steady support, real conversations, weekly prompts based on our grief framework, and guided tools you can use at your own pace.
You'll also get early access to workshops, new resources, and behind-the-scene updates from our podcast. If you want a community that's honest, compassionate, and grounded in practical support, come join us. Just search the Grief Ladies community on Facebook. We'd love to have you. Yeah, I agree. And I think that's what Karen and I always talk about. Like, our grief groups have a little bit of everything. It's, we're going to laugh and we're going to, and that's not a bad thing. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes people are like, oh, it's a grief group, but we're humans at the end of the day. And we also, people tell stories about their loved ones and they're hysterical stories. And I love
Oh,
that part, right? You know, we get to
absolutely.
hear these
Yeah.
amazing things about their loved ones and get to talk about those good memories. So, you know, one of
Yes.
the things, along with the stigma base, I think, is also just a lack of maybe understanding of suicide. You know, I think we're still using words like committed suicide, even though we know that that's not really grief informed anymore. And then there's people that make statements like that suicide is selfish. What would you want people to understand about suicide and maybe some of the myths associated with it?
I think, it differs for everybody, but what I tend to see is that suicide, it typically is not an impulsive action. Sometimes it is. And I think among younger people, I think it can be an impulse. Um, but for a lot of people, it is the end of the road. Like there are no other options. And Um, I think a lot of times bipolar disorder is present. I know that was a factor in my sister's death. And so if you have mental health challenges that you don't feel like you can be open about, if your family doesn't understand, if um, you've been fired from your job, a lot of times it's an accumulation of things where all of a sudden it's like, I give, like I can't overcome because it's like piling on, right? So it's never just one thing. So people may not see the signs, like Robin Williams, perfect example, like funny, warm, you know, um, you're masking, you're masking what is hurting so deeply underneath. And that's what I try and focus on, I think, is that hurt and pain because you can't see that. But if you are experiencing it yourself and you literally cannot see anything else, you're just tunnel vision, which I think is what happened with my sisters. There's nothing that could change about this. Then I understand that. I think so. I think offering people grace and not making assumptions about what that person experienced. 'Cause we don't know, you know. Nobody's in another person's head when they make that choice. But I do think that in most cases, it is getting relief from pain that is just completely overwhelming and you don't see a way out.
Yeah, that's one of the ways that I heard it explained one time. They said it was almost like being in a house that's on fire and you only see one exit. Like there's only one way out of here, and
Yeah.
I thought that that was something that, we could kind of visualize and resonate with because we know in our grief work that we do, and it doesn't seem to matter who it was, the relationship, how it happened, the people who are left behind are taking some level of responsibility. I think in suicide loss, that's probably even amplified even more. Trying to figure out, did I miss something or did I, was I not enough or, whatever those questions may be. So, one of the things you were talking about before was groups and the importance of those groups. And I think, listen, if you live in an area that the support is limited and the only thing, let's say, you can find is a general grief group or something, I mean, grief support is wonderful. But I think there are particular losses where being with your population is especially important. And I do think this is one of those. I think being around other people who've also had suicide loss is really, just more opportunity to feel like you can speak openly and that you don't have to explain yourself or explain your loved one or try to apologize for them or anything like that. So Sarah, tell us a little bit more about some of the things that you were telling us in terms of like studies and things like that you've been working with.
So, one of my primary goals is to improve clinician training because what I found I did some doctoral level research, and one of the findings that surprised me the most is the majority of people that are working in even grief, but specifically in clinical roles, so counselor, psychologist, across the board, really, there is on average about 4 hours of training on suicide. And because postvention specifically is such an afterthought, just generally speaking, you can imagine that there really is very little on postvention. And so I am in the process of conducting survivor interviews. So I'm having conversations. It's a qualitative process. So it's very conversational, kind of like we're doing. But talking with people about what they experience, not the death, that's there. We talk about what they've experienced after that person died. And I've developed about 8 to 10 themes across the different interviews that are really striking. And I think one of the themes that came up a lot last night in the interview was closeness doesn't determine the the loss that someone experienced. Because I think there's this perception. Um, Last night I interviewed someone that she lost her twin sister to suicide, and they were very close, and the death was devastating. In fact, yesterday was the 12-year anniversary. She also lost her father to suicide, and she said that didn't have much of an impact because he had left the family. They didn't really have a relationship, and so one of the themes again across these is you can't necessarily assume that someone is going to grieve in a particular way based on a family system, right? This a bonus mom was also on the interview. So I had the bonus mom and the twin sister, and the bonus mom is not related, um, biologically, but she grieved intensely, and her own family didn't understand why she was taking this so hard, and she had to explain, "This is like my daughter," And so I think um, just helping people understand kind of got away from what I'm working on, but finding those themes and focusing training on lived experience instead of here's what the clinical book work says, because it's much more relevant to know what people actually experience and what helps and what harms. And so that's what I'm doing right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's so many questions that come. And again, with all loss, we can have questions. Why did this happen? Why him? Why now? But I think there are losses like suicide and substance abuse where we have more questions in the aftermath. And again, in terms of like, what were they thinking and maybe our responsibility through all of that. I know one thing that I talk to people about and trying, from my perspective, help them understand is that I think there are certain things, and when it comes to mental health, there is no amount of love that it's not how close we are, it's not how close the family was, but it's just we're thinking maybe we could have loved them more or done more, but we are limited, and mental health is bigger than us, and it takes over in ways that aren't rational and that don't follow the path of what they think we should. So knowing that that's really what any person going through it, any family member is up against is it's so much bigger than us, I feel like.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a big piece of it, and helping people understand that. I think one of the other interesting things that I found in my research is the presence of social determinants of health, not even for the person that dies by suicide, but the family impacted by suicide. It's very, very common to have pre-existing issues like poverty, addiction, family dysfunction, generational trauma, sexual abuse, different factors that exist in that family system before a suicide occurs. So it's I think one of the things that's really misunderstood about suicide is the nuance.
Mm,
It's not just like made this split decision, I'm out of here. There's this complexity. And I think that's what I'm finding in these interviews too, is everybody's story. There's just so many factors. And I think that that's a huge part of the healing process and why it takes longer to heal from suicide. I believe it's the grief period is 3 to 5 years. And I'm in year 6 and I still work through things. So there's no time. I think that's the other piece is like, aren't you over that yet? Grief doesn't end. It changes. I interviewed someone recently that lost his partner 17 years ago. And he said in the interview, sometimes it still feels like yesterday. So this isn't something that you get over. You work through it, you live alongside, is what I like to say. You live alongside that loss, and it changes who you are as a person.
There's definitely no timetable, and I think then also as we move through our own life and then we have other losses, it just compounds it. And sometimes we go back and regrieve some of the earlier losses and look at things differently as well. So it's definitely not just something one of our other podcast guests called it like a suitcase that you just carry along, right? And sometimes it's heavier and sometimes it's lighter. And
Exactly.
I think,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. One of the things that I have often thought about in my own grief journey is the fact that the time leading up to birthdays and anniversaries are incredibly difficult. And then the day of, I'm fine. Like it's just
exactly.
this anticipation of the day that is so hard. And if you do not understand that, it shows up as unfocused, lack of performance. Um, After my sister died, I was a contractor at Starbucks corporate office, and they hired me on to provide benefits, which was lovely. Um, but I was just covering a maternity leave. And so between COVID and I was not my best self, and I acknowledge that 100%. But if you look at the actual, elements of grief, it was like, well, no wonder, you know,
Yeah.
like, but it was perceived as performance issue. And that was made very clear. So you know, there's, you just have to give people grace. And I think it's so interesting to me because grief is universal. If you love, you will grieve. And if you live, you will grieve. Um, and so it still baffles me that there's just this epic discomfort around talking about it, addressing it. One of the things that is most uncomfortable, I think, about suicide loss too, is that silence. People don't know what to say, so they don't say anything. And it is so painful. I had, I don't know if you're familiar with Ragnar. It's a running relay that I did with college friends for years. And the year after Heidi died, it was canceled because of COVID. Um, but the next year, I went to participate, and there's 12 runners and, people that are driving. And so there's probably 16 people involved, and not one person said, "How are you doing?" Or like, "I'm so sorry." Not one person. And so I lost friends because I couldn't imagine how uncaring that is, to not even ask a person. Meanwhile, one of our team members had cancer, and there was, we were doing the fun runs, and it's like, it, it's universal. Pain is universal. It doesn't, but suicide is different, you know? Um, and I think another thing too, which I think is important for your listeners to hear, is my sister and I were not close. And so people were like, "Why do you care? Like, why is this an issue?" And again, it is so complex. It was way beyond my sister making that choice. It was, how did she get there? And how did we as a family not um, walk alongside her? And, there's just a lot of things. And that goes back, it's generational. It's not, and so it's just a long journey. And I think that is so uncomfortable for people. But one of the things that I like to recommend is, if you want to support someone that has lost someone to suicide, I think one of the most lovely things is tell me about Heidi. Like, who was she as a person? And that's how I start the interviews that I have been doing with suicide loss survivors, is tell me about that person. Like, who were they? Because I think we talk about how they died and they lived. Heidi had this bigger than life. She's incredibly artistic, like amazing, worked at Nordstrom as a UX director, like brilliant career, funny. So why are we focused on the way she died?
Well, Sarah, you just gave me the easiest lead into the Celebrate Their Life segment ever.
That was my whole plan.
So, Celebrate Their Life really is to be able to shift from the focusing on the death to focusing on the life. And how can we still honor and remember our loved ones? How can we celebrate their life, the good memories, and how can we stay connected to them? So, how do you celebrate Heidi's life?
Are you ready to take the next step on your grief journey with real tools and compassionate guidance? The Grief Ladies are launching a brand new workshop series based on their signature grief GRIEF framework. 5 trail markers to help you find your footing after your loss: grounding, rebuilding, interacting, evolving, and finding. Each workshop focuses on one trail marker, guiding you through practical steps to move from surviving to living again, all in a space that's honest, supportive, and real. Led by grief experts Kelly Doherty and Karen Arnold, these workshops combine decades of experience with tools you can start using today. Visit griefladies.com to explore the upcoming workshops, because you don't have to climb this mountain alone.
I celebrate her in little ways and big ways. So I always plan to either go for a hike or a beautiful drive or something. For the majority of the time since she died, I was living in Washington State. So usually I would go to a lake or sit on the beach somewhere, and just honor her, think about her. And sometimes there's sadness and sometimes there's not. Um, on a day-to-day basis, I feel like what I am doing with my life is honoring her, because I think that I certainly didn't plan to get into this work, but that gap was so huge, and there's so many people that are impacted by suicide loss. So for every suicide loss, between 5 family members and 135 community members are impacted. So around 50,000 people die by suicide each year. So it's like 200,000 to 300,000 people to up to 6.7 million that become new survivors every year. And so this isn't, there's so many people that are impacted, and it could be a colleague, it could be a school buddy, it doesn't, there's no discrimination there, but it's so common, and yet there are not tools for people. And so I think it's so important to talk openly about it. I think that's, people talk about storytelling, and that's essential. It's tell your story about that person. And I kind of forgot your question.
It's perfect. It was about celebrating Heidi's life. So you did it.
Yeah. So, but the other thing that I would say, and, I think people feel one way or the other, but I completely unplanned had the opportunity to meet with a medium after Heidi died, and it rocked my world. Like, I never would have thought that would, impact me. But I feel like, I often say, I feel like I have the relationship with her in death that I never could have had in life. I'm a twin, and when my twin and I were born, Heidi was 4. And so I think she was pissed. Like, she's like, excuse me, like, but what about me? Because she was kind of an only child for 4 years, right? And then this was back before IVF. So everybody's like, oh, the twins. And, and Heidi was like, excuse me. And she was pretty blunt about that. Like, you ruined my life. Um, but um, I feel a relationship with her that I never in a million years expected to have. And um, there's a song that it's called Orange Sky by Alexi Murdoch. And I have, my playlist on Spotify. There's probably like 600 songs or something on there. And like last night after that interview, it was a really profound interview. And I got off and I was making dinner in Orange Sky Place. Like, there's just like little, a butterfly, there's little signs, angel numbers. And so I think, why not? Like, whether it's real or not, like, if that provides some sense of knowing that that person is right there, um, I think that should be embraced.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have a medium, we've had one on the podcast, and she talked about, just because you had a relationship with someone when they were alive, having one with them in spirit can look very different,
Very different.
and in some
Yeah.
ways better.
Yeah.
Much better. And I think it's because, I won't go too far into it, but those burdens have all been lifted, right? All of the pain and family dynamics and all of the things that make us who we are removed. And so I think it's actually quite beautiful that that person um, can sort of be who they wanted to be without the pain, right? So that's how I like to think about it.
That's a nice way to look at it. And and before we shift gears and start to, ask you a few things in closing, I just anytime there is that situation where we had a relationship with a person that was complex, and we if we lose that person, we probably also had some friends or people that we spend time with that knew that that relationship was complex, and so therefore they may not be as supportive in the grief because they don't really understand. We think that grief is only, for the best of relationships or something, which is not at all the case. And, just trying to help people understand that we can also grieve what we didn't have. Sometimes our grief is for what we lost, but we're also grieving what we never got to have or what we hoped time would allow that we don't have time to resolve or rectify. I mean, there's so many things that grief can make very, very final, or that loss can make very final. So I don't know. I just always want to make sure that people understand that message too, because I do think that that gets misunderstood. So,
Yeah,
um,
I agree. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Well, Sarah, so we always like to leave everybody with some kind of an actionable step, something that they could start right away, to kind of get them on the path. We try to be, action oriented and give people ideas of some tools that will help. What are some things or a thing that a person could start today that you think would help them on their grief journey?
I think for somebody that has lost a person to suicide specifically, it's really important to seek out opportunities to meet other people that have experienced the same loss. Because there's something about that stigma being removed that just allows you to feel understood, to feel less isolated. Um, there can be differences in your story, but that stigma is removed. And I think that's such a huge part of healing for people that have lost someone to suicide. I think the other thing that has come up um, in all of the interviews I've done is that it requires talking, like talk, talk, talk it out. Don't, because there's so much ruminating that goes on with suicide loss. You're just in your head about what could have been done differently. There's just so much. It's so complex. And sometimes even just writing it, it loses its power sometimes when you say it out loud or you write it down. But I will say all day long, seek out other people that have been through the same loss. And I'm like I call myself an avid introvert. I am not one of those people that loves support groups. But there's something about being in a group of people where they're like, I get it, and the head nod. And um, there's just something really powerfully healing about that. So that's the biggest one. And I think for people that want to support someone who's lost someone to suicide, one of the things that comes up frequently is, let me know if I can do anything. Absolutely useless. No one knows, especially when you're in early grief. You don't know your head from your butt. Like, you're not going to be able to say, you can help me with this. Like, no. So either say, I'm like, if it's somebody that has children, I'm picking up my kids on Thursday. Would you like me to pick up your kids? I'm going to the grocery store. Can I bring you anything? Can I come and sit with you? We don't have to say anything. I can just sit with you. One of the people that I interviewed said, I just wanted somebody to sit at the dining room table with me and just sit there, not say anything, just be there, because it's so isolating. So you don't have to say the perfect right thing. There is no perfect right thing, right? You just have to say, I am here. I don't know what to say, but I'm here. And sometimes it leads to laughter, and it's just, yeah, but
Yeah.
talk about it. That's the biggest thing.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's really good advice. And even going back to the idea of the group, and one interesting thing I learned about introverts, it's not so much about being shy, it's craving real connection in interactions, not
Yes.
really being able to tolerate, if you will, just the surface conversations. And what I think is endlessly fascinating about support groups, and I'm sure Kelly and I have both seen this through the years, is how quickly conversations can happen because you're there for one thing, and all the other stuff that normally is required to get a conversation going or to get to know people. It's like, we have this in common, and, that's all that matters right now. And I see people by the end of a group, when I used to, especially when I did them in person, exchanging phone numbers or walking out to the parking lot together, and it's just this great thing. So even if you feel like you're not a group person, which I would probably self-identify as, it's like there's still such wonderful things. So, Sara, this has been so helpful. If anybody wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, and my website is called the Postvention Project. So it's www.postventionproject.com. And my email address is Sara, Sara, at postventionproject.com. So that's probably the best way. Yeah.
Wonderful. And we always leave links, to all of that with our show notes. So, Sara, this has been so helpful. We're just so grateful to have you here today. Kelly, thank you for everything, Sara, and thanks to everybody. Hopefully we'll get to see you again.
Thanks for joining us on The Grief Ladies.
Don't wait to feel better to get started. Getting started is what makes you feel better. Put this week's tool to work.
If today's episode helped, share it with someone who needs it and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you.
And remember, we're here for you, your trusted grief ladies, navigating this path together.